So in this video, I wanted to take a break from some of the other style of videos that I've been doing and just have a discussion about whether or not it's likely that Jenn is going to end up facing charges over the things that occurred to Maddie. Because this is one of the most common things that comes up in the comments section in all my videos. All of us want to see Jenn charged, and we want to see her behind bars, I think, or the majority of us. And the more I dig into looking at Jenn, the more I think that she deserves to be behind bars. She certainly, we can agree that her actions definitely contributed to her daughter's demise, which that alone should be enough for her to face charges. But when you look at the things that she said in interviews, you have these massive discrepancies. You have these very obvious lies. So many people sit there and scratch their heads and think, why isn't Jenn in jail yet? And I know this has been discussed millions of times over, but I wanted to just share my thoughts based on where I'm at, having looked at the various interviews and stuff that have occurred, having looked at the documents, having looked at all the evidence. So, first of all, I want to start by talking about what sort of charges Jenn could potentially face. And then look at the factors behind whether or not she may eventually be charged. Now, before I jump into that, I do want to just say a huge shout out and thank you to everyone who supports me in every way. You've probably noticed that I've been having a lot of issues with YouTube turning comments off on my videos, and then I have to turn them back on, and quite often when I turn them back on they get turned off again. Then the most recent video that I did, YouTube just decided to demonetize that video, so hours and hours of work, and basically I get the comments turned off and I get the video demonetized, and that sort of thing is so discouraging. You know, I'm doing this for Maddie. I'm doing this because Maddie needs someone to be a voice for her. But at the same time, when you put in countless hours into creating this content, then there does need to be some money coming back for it, or otherwise you need to be reimbursed for your time, at least partially, because otherwise you're putting so much of your time into this venture, and you know, when you could be working on other things and postponing study for the purpose of pursuing this YouTube thing, things like that. It then becomes discouraging when YouTube basically slaps you in the face and goes, sorry, turning off your comments, demonetizing your video. So I do want to shout out to everyone who supports me in every way. The comments that I see in my videos, it's so encouraging. When I see that people have listened to what I've said and they've come up with their own ideas based on what I've said, I know I'm making a difference. And when people express their gratitude in the comments, I know I'm making a difference. And when people become members of my channel, that just gives that extra support for me and for my channel, and it's the things like that that help me to continue pushing for justice for Maddie and to push for justice in future cases. And of course, the buy me a coffees, the super thanks, all these things support me and help me to push on and feel that I can do this. So a huge thank you to every single person who supports me in every way. Even just subscribing to my channel that's enough. You know, that gives me support, that helps me grow my channel. It helps me get these videos out there into a wider audience. So it makes a difference. So, first of all, I want to talk about the various charges that Jenn could be facing in the future. And these come into two categories. One to do with her essentially covering up for Stearns. Could she be charged with accessory before the fact or after the fact? Accessory before the fact because she sent her daughter upstairs with that predator. Had she not done that action, her daughter would not have died. Maddie would still be alive today. The problem there is to prove that she was completely unaware of the dangers posed to her daughter. Tricky. Accessory after the fact. We know Jenn allowed him to use her car. She skirts around it in some interviews, but she has stated outright at times that she did allow him to use her car. And while he was using her car, he returned to the location where he left Maddie. While he was using her car, he drove down to Northport. He entered his parents' house. He tried to log on to his Google account. He removed the hard drive from that computer. And we don't know what happened to that hard drive. Can they prove that she loaned him her car and had knowledge of the reasons for him using her car? Then they can charge her. Her statements to police, where she gave contradictory statements, where she lied. If they can prove that she did this for Stefan's benefit, she did this with the knowledge of what he had done, they can charge her. I think in terms of the death penalty offence, the unaliving of Maddie, I think it's going to be harder for them to bring charges against her in terms of her covering up for Stearns, unless they have solid stuff from somewhere that proves that. Her statements in interviews, while inconsistent, and her lies aren't going to be enough. So first of all, I want to take a look at what Florida statute says in terms of various laws that could be potentially the reasoning for Jenn being charged and prosecuted. Okay, so let's talk about being an accessory to a crime or co-conspirator. I'm going to say Jenn was not a co-conspirator. I don't believe that there were plans made beforehand. I believe that Stefan had originally planned to do his usual things with Maddie and something went wrong. But what does it look like in terms of being an accessory to the crime? Well, here are some things under Florida statute, and the first three do not apply. So, hiring someone to commit the crime, instigating the commission of the crime, giving advice on how to carry out the crime. We can forget them. But concealing the crime before or after the fact. So if they in any way knowingly assisted, contributed to, aided or offered advice to another so they could commit a crime. So basically, if it can be proven that Jenn knew what Stefan had done and she knowingly assisted him in any way after the event, then prosecutors can charge her. And what does that mean? She would be charged with a second-degree felony. That means she could spend up to 15 years in prison and be fined $10,000. This charge, I think, as I said, could be the more difficult one to prove, unless they can prove that she knowingly loaned him her car, knowing the exact reason that he was using it. If they can prove any of her actions from that morning through to when Stearns was arrested, if they can prove anything she did there was done with full knowledge of what had occurred, with the intent of basically protecting Stearns, then they can charge her. Let's talk about the bigger one though, and that is aggravated child neglect. This one is clearly covered under Florida law, and I believe that this is the thing that Jenn will definitely be facing in her future. So I'm going to go through this document here. So this is the more serious form of child neglect, and it will be prosecuted vigorously by law enforcement. What the state prosecutor has to prove to convict a defendant of this crime. The state prosecutor has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant willfully or by culpable negligence failed or omitted to provide the victim with the care, supervision and services necessary to maintain the victim's physical or mental health, or 2, failed to make a reasonable effort to protect the victim from abuse, neglect or exploitation by another person. 2, while doing the above, the defendant caused great bodily harm, permanent disability or permanent disfigurement to the victim. 3, defendant was a caregiver for the victim and the victim was under the age of 18. So we can tick off 2, 3 and 4 because Madeline died because of Jenn's negligence. Jenn was supposed to be the caregiver for Madeline, and Maddie was definitely under the age of 18. If we look at point 1, the willfully or by culpable negligence failed or omitted to provide the victim with the care, supervision and services necessary to maintain the victim's physical or mental health. Bingo. She did not provide the supervision. She let her daughter be alone in a room with a male that was not her daughter's biological father. Not only did she allow her to be alone in a room with that man, but she allowed her to sleep alone in a room with that man. If that is not culpable negligence, what is? And did this result in harm to the victim's physical or mental health? Both. They could, in fact, for every instance that they can prove that she allowed Stefan and Maddie to sleep in a room unsupervised upstairs, could bring a charge, meaning that she could face multiple charges for this. And as for point 2, failed to make a reasonable effort to protect the victim from abuse, neglect or exploitation by another person. Now, I think it wouldn't be hard to argue that a reasonable effort would include not sending your child upstairs to a room with a predator to sleep with them overnight. So I think in terms of charges for neglect, I think it is quite possible that Jenn is going to be facing aggravated child neglect charges. And for every instance of her allowing Stefan access to her child without supervision, that could be a separate charge. Punishment. The crime is a second-degree felony which is punishable by up to 15 years in prison and $10,000 fine. Could they stack it up and have multiple charges? Yes, they could. Could this mean that Jenn goes away for a very, very long time? Yes, I believe it could. So, let's move on and look at the things that the things that could work towards getting these charges occurring, and the issues that could arise which make it harder to get these charges. Now for this, I'm basically just going to go through my notes start to finish, so they're not in any specific order. It's more about looking at all the different factors as I've noted them. So the first thing we need to consider, if we are looking at the charges to do with her as an accessory, well, the problem there is that, and I know people have said, well, why can't they get Stearns to speak up and dub her in it? The problem is Stearns is not a credible witness. And were they to bring these charges against Jenn, were it to go to trial, a defence team would just chew him up. Because when you look at the interviews that he did with detectives after Maddie went missing, they were pure fiction. So his word means nothing. The guy is not known for honesty, and that can be easily proven. So they certainly could not prosecute her based on anything that has been said by Stefan. But let's talk about motivation for prosecuting Jenn. I think we've seen in the interview the video interview, if you watch that, you see there are instances when you have Detective Kevin, his whole body is rigid, like he is trying to stop himself from jumping across that table and throttling Jennifer Soto. He admits he's got his own children. This is a father who's dealing with a child who at the time they believed was deceased, and they wanted to find her body. And you could see he really disliked Jenn Soto. This is a detective who had to deal with the after effects of the crime. I suspect that he would quite gladly put in multiple hours to investigate Jennifer Soto to ensure that she gets all the charges that she deserves. The other detective, now the first thing I noticed when I watched that interview was just how fast his foot was moving through a lot of the interview. And something that stuck with me watching an episode of Judy Ron, I think it was Ed Wallace, commented on his foot being like a rattlesnake, and I thought that was such a great description. Neither of those detectives believed the crap that Jenn was spouting. Neither of them showed that they particularly liked Jenn. And let's not forget, like I said, they've had to deal with the after effects of this crime. They've seen so much more of this case than we have. They know so much more about this case than we have. I can't imagine them just going, oh well, Jenn Soto, she's a pile of crap, but let's just not bother putting the effort to prosecute her. I believe that they will have worked their butts off to put together a case to make sure that she is prosecuted and that she faces charges in the future. And I'll come back to that in a moment and speak more about the detectives and their strategies further on. Now, let's talk about Jenn's mental health issues. Because you can bet that if she's charged and she goes to court, that this is going to be the number one defence. The defence that Jenn struggles with bipolar, she struggles with depression, she has all these mental health issues. They're going to talk about her missing her meds and that impacted on her decision making and the reason that she allowed Maddie and Stefan to go upstairs. They would bring up this claim that she made of having been hospitalised in the past, because that's going to prove delicate mental health. And if these rumours are true that were started by the Stearnses, that she was subsequently hospitalised for mental health after Maddie was found, then that is also going to be raised. But let's think about this. Let's break this down. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people out there who manage to function every day with bipolar. Parents, including single parents, who manage to give their children a healthy, well-balanced home life, and who don't place their children in a situation where their children are then at risk of serious physical harm. Jenn claims that she missed her meds, and that was causing all manner of grief for her. But can we think about what that really means? Now, I asked this question in one of my recent videos, and thankfully, because this is such a great community of commenters, thinkers, subscribers, a number of people helped me out on this. Bipolar meds, as I suspected, work in a cumulative manner, just like other meds for mental health conditions. That basically means that when you first start on those meds, you may not see an immediate difference because they have to build up in your bloodstream. They have to have that effect on the pathways in your brain. And it takes a while for you to see an effect. Now, the flip side of that is that if you miss one lot of medication, it's not going to have a significant impact on your mental health because there is already a build-up of that medication in your system. So it's not going to be this sudden plunge into a deep abyss, which is what Jenn tried to say in that interview. You may feel a little lightheaded. You may just feel a little bit funny or a little bit off. But it's not going to be serious effects. Quite often the advice for someone with these sorts of medications is if you miss one, that's okay, just take the next one at the regular time. Don't try to take a double dose at the regular time or anything like that. Just continue on as you were. And it's my understanding that having had your next medication, you would be completely fine. So it's not the big drama that Jenn made it out to be. And I also want to point out one thing. That is the fact that in her interviews, this mental health thing, the need for the sleep because she missed her meds, this only came up in later interviews. This was not something that she originally brought up. She just said her sleep patterns were messed up because of her new job. She was essentially saying in the beginning that she just needed sleep because she was tired. Well, so many of us have days when we are just tired, but we still make sure that we are doing the things that we have to do. To me, being tired is not an excuse for sending your child to sleep upstairs with a predator. And not only that, this whole excuse falls flat completely because when asked in the derivative use interview, had she ever had an instance where she sent Maddie upstairs alone when Stefan wasn't around so that she could get a good night's sleep? Her answer was no. She never ever sent Maddie off to sleep on her own for the sake of her getting a good night's sleep. So that pretty much throws this whole defence out the window, in my opinion. Of course, it would come down to, in court, you would of course have the argument with, you'd have different specialists come in. You'd have one for each side, one for defence, one for prosecution, who would argue the point. And obviously, at the end of the day, it would come down to whether or not the jury believed that Jenn couldn't be held culpable because she desperately needed that sleep and desperately needed to have a bed all to herself. I think a decent prosecution would be able to prove that there were options other than her simply sending Madeline to sleep with Stefan. We heard from one of the flatmates who mentioned that Stefan had slept on the couch in the past. We also know that Maddie had her little fake room, which was another option. It was never necessary for the pair of them to be sent upstairs together. Now, another argument I've heard from people is that Jenn was the victim of Stefan also. That he chose his relationship with her to gain access to Maddie. And yes, I believe that probably is the case. But I don't think that Jenn is quite as dumb as what people believe. I don't think she was as heavily manipulated as what people believe. We have seen through the interviews that she is actually quite capable of being a manipulative individual herself. We've also heard multiple comments which would give the impression that in that trio she has considerable power. She is the one who sent the pair of them upstairs to sleep together. She says, "I let him do what he wants." That's not about him controlling her and her having no choice in the matter. What she's saying there is that she has acknowledged that she could stop him and she just doesn't bother. Jenn has shown us that A, she's manipulative, B, she has control over Stearns and over his actions. And she will use that control when it suits her, such as sending her daughter upstairs to sleep with Stearns. Yes, it could be argued that apparently he came across as being so empathetic that she believed that he would never hurt her daughter, but then you get all the other things like Woody Allen comments and stuff like that, and her saying that she learned never to trust men. So, to paint Jenn as the victim, I think that would be difficult. So I think that to put together a prosecution of Jenn, I don't think they would have to be concerned about her appearing as a victim. I believe she's shown that while she may have been targeted originally because he wanted access to Maddie, I believe that Jenn's not as dumb as she comes across. and we've seen that. Now, let's talk about her lying in her interviews and the inconsistencies. These are recorded. They have audio and video recordings of her lying. They can prove that she lied. They have data from her phone, from Stearns' phone, that they can use to prove that she lied. This is certainly something that I think would be taken into account and something that could be used against her in terms of creating a case to prosecute her. I think there is enough of her lies and inconsistencies to use in a case, provided there is other evidence. I think on its own, it would be hard to convince a jury just based on her lies and inconsistencies. You could argue that she was just muddle-headed because of her medications. And we know that she's claimed that herself. And all it would take would be a really good witness to, like a specialist witness, to come forward and say, well, I'm a super duper expert on these things, and this is why she said these things, because of her mental health. So these are not things that would be solid enough for bringing charges against Jenn. But we have witnesses. When it comes to aggravated neglect, so the child neglect charges, there are quite a few witnesses that could be called in a trial to show that Jenn had knowledge, and that Jenn had knowledge that her actions weren't right. I would imagine, under subpoena, that there could be some interesting comments from her family. I believe that there's some quite intelligent people in her family who probably saw things, were aware of things that they haven't spoken out about, but who, under subpoena, may in fact divulge information. We do know that on the Saturday before Maddie's party, she was so distraught, and this is an account from Yolanda, she was so distraught that she did not want to go home. And Yolanda organised for Maddie to spend time with her grandfather instead. Were there previous instances of these kind of things? Because they are things that would be used to prove that Maddie's home life was not great. You have the flatmates of Jenn. In particular, you have Natalie, who witnessed Maddie and Stefan alone together in Stefan's room when Jenn was absent. Jenn wasn't in the house. And she messaged Jenn because to her it did not look right. And she asked Jenn, "Are you okay with this?" And Jenn responded with, "You're good." So this is something that could be used to show that this was raised to Jenn as a problem, and yet she ignored the problem. This could help in building a case against Jenn. You have her ex-husband, Stephen, talking about the marriage basically breaking up because of Jenn's deterioration in mental health and him wanting to get his daughter out of that situation. Unfortunately, Maddie got left behind without the two allies who possibly could have made a huge difference in her life. But that certainly points to issues of neglect from Jenn, and it certainly points to the things that happened at a later date. Let's also talk about Stefan's Disney girlfriend. Apparently, you're not meant to mention her name because she threatens legal suits. So I'll just call her the Disney girlfriend. But her interview with detectives was very, very revealing. She spoke about Stefan sleeping in a bed with Maddie wearing only boxer shorts. She spoke about him coming out of the bathroom when Maddie and Jenn were both in Jenn's room, and him coming out of the bathroom stark naked. This in front of a 12-year-old child. And who knows how long that had been going on for. At what age Maddie started witnessing these things. What was Jenn's actions there? None. She allowed it to happen. This from a woman who claims that she's experienced her own trauma relating to SA. This from a woman who reckons that she was hypervigilant, and yet she allowed that to happen. The Disney girlfriend also spoke about an instance of Stefan, and we don't know if this is more than one instance, of Stefan waking up with a boner. I don't know how to word this properly without YouTube coming at me. But of Stefan waking up somewhat aroused and having to roll over so that he wasn't facing or touching Maddie. These are things that Jenn was allowing. Let's talk about Deb Stearns and what she had said to Jenn. They had been staying at their house, and she had insisted that while they were staying at her house, that Maddie would not be sleeping in a bed with Jenn and Stefan. And she says that she told them Maddie was too old for that and it shouldn't be happening. Jenn was told these things, and she allowed it to continue. At the end of the day, I think they would have plenty of witnesses in terms of aggravated negligence or aggravated child negligence, let's say. Now, the other thing to consider here is that they have many images of the actions that Stearns did with Maddie. So you have the metadata from Stefan's phone for all those instances where he essayed Maddie. What does that show? That shows times, dates, locations. And you can be sure that having downloaded all Jenn's phone data, that they will have done a comparison to show those occasions when Jenn was present. They can use her phone to show that Jenn was present at the house at the times when these things occurred. And I bet that's going to paint a very interesting picture. Not only that, but we know from the interview, from the derivative use interview, that they have retrieved multiple text messages where the discussion occurred of Maddie sleeping with Stefan. They have proof, not just from interviewing Jenn, but they have digital evidence. They have messages from Jenn discussing Maddie sleeping with Stefan. That alone is pretty damn solid proof. Any reasonable parent is going to recognise that it is not advisable to be sending your child, your 12-year-old, your 11-year-old, your 10-year-old, and that's how far back they can prove it, to be sending this child upstairs to sleep alone with a male, 37-year-old male, who's not even her bio dad. Not that you would even allow the bio dad to be sleeping alone with a child of that age if you were a decent human being. So we know that there are text messages proving that she allowed this. And yes, we do have her own admissions on video interviews, on audio interviews of her sending them upstairs together and allowing them to go upstairs together. I think this would be solid enough to convince the jury of aggravated negligence. These are actions which caused harm for her daughter, and which any reasonable parent should know would result in harm for her daughter. The Woody Allen comment. This comment of she was worried it would turn into a Woody Allen situation of him grooming the child and then them running off together when they were 18. That is not a comment that you would expect in a normal relationship with a ex-boyfriend or partner or whatever the F she decided he was at that point in time. To me, that is an admission of guilt. That is an acknowledgement of a unsuitable relationship existing between Maddie and Stefan. This one statement alone would, I believe, be solid evidence for a jury. The comment when they mentioned about Maddie being deceased and her essentially saying that the sex stuff wasn't evil. They have that recorded, and I think given how we reacted, I think we can imagine how a jury would react as well. So there's a lot of things here that could be used to demonstrate aggravated negligence, that her actions, or lack of actions, caused harm for her child, harm which eventuated in her child's death. Let's not forget the harm of at least 4 years worth of serious trauma for that child. This woman deserves major, major charges, and I hope that when charges are brought against her, that they are multiple charges. Now, the tricky part with that, but I don't think it would be enough, is that there are plenty of images of Maddie which show her clothed in clean clothes, looking healthy enough. You have family members and flatmates who would probably say she was fed and clothed and provided a roof over her head, even if she wasn't provided her own room. But you certainly could argue that, well, in every other respect, this child was well cared for by the parent. But I think when you look at what was going on, that far outweighs any attempt at being a good parent by Jenn. Now, let's go back to talking about Maddie's death, and if they can prove that Jenn helped cover up for Stefan, meaning she had to have knowingly provided him assistance. In that video interview, she says some pretty damning things. She's pretty damn specific about details. They ask her how she thinks Maddie died. It sounds pretty damn specific to me. And she refers to there being no evidence, no mess. And then claims that, well, she wouldn't know because she never went upstairs. And questions the detectives, well, was there evidence? Was there mess? This certainly does not look good for Jenn. She also, when questioned, gives a fairly accurate account of his movements. She refers to him moving Maddie's body. She refers to him going back to Maddie's body. And in fact, it sounds like she refers to him moving her 2 times, which he did. He moved her from the crime scene to the vehicle, to the boot of the vehicle, and then to where he left her. When you listen to the way Jenn talks about it, it does seem very specific. You have her talking about Lake Lizzie, and if you follow the route that Stearns was taking, if you account for the fact that he didn't reach his final destination, the fact that he was headed in the direction of Lake Lizzie doesn't look good for Jenn. Of course, those things on their own could not be used to prosecute her, because it could be argued, well, they were just informed guesses. But if they have other solid evidence to prove her knowledge, then those things will certainly stack up. So let's talk about why they would wait to prosecute Jenn. Why is she not in jail yet? I think a lot of people are looking at this and saying, well, it's now heading up to, well, it's 10 months now since Maddie was found. 10 months that she's been walking free when Stefan's been locked up. And a lot of people think, well, that indicates that she'll never be prosecuted. A lot of people are angry because they think that she'll never be prosecuted. But let's have a think about what could be going on here. The number one priority for prosecutors, as much as we want to see Jenn arrested and locked up, the number one priority is to get the maximum sentence for Stefan Stearns. This is a man who victimised this child for at least 4 years, most likely for the full 7 years that he was in her life. That alone deserves the maximum penalty that can be given in that instance. And then, after all those years of abuse, he ended her life. So, naturally, the number one goal here is to see that he receives the maximum penalties for his actions. Now, yes, they have thousands of images that are essentially on their own going to convict him. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with juries, you're looking at emotions as well. And how better to manipulate the emotions of a jury, and I do say manipulate because that is part of what prosecutors and defenders do. They manipulate the jury. They work on ways to manipulate the jury. Yes, they present evidence, but they also manipulate the jury. They use their little tricks. Things that they know are inadmissible, and they accidentally slip up and put that thought in the head of jurors anyway, even though they know that it's inadmissible and they're going to get called out on it. Once the jury have heard it, it's still going to be there at the back of their mind. You can't unhear something even if you are told to disregard it. And that is such a common trick that you see in so many court cases. But the way the jury perceives Jenn is going to be crucial. So the prosecution are not going to want to tarnish that in any way by having charges against this woman, because you can be guaranteed that if there were charges brought against Jenn before Stearns' trial, that his defence team would use those to manipulate the jury to gain some sort of sympathy for Stefan. It would help them to provide a case where they say that Jenn was the mastermind in all this. It would help them to be able to say, well, Jenn basically made it really, really easy for him, so he shouldn't be considered completely culpable here. There are so many things that, if Jenn is presented in a bad light prior to Stearns' trial that could prevent getting a maximum penalty for him. Not only that, they want her to be as cooperative as possible with the prosecution team. They don't want a hostile witness. They want her on side. If she has charges pending against her, well, if she has charges that have been made and she is facing her own trial, then she's not going to be as malleable for the prosecution team as she would be as a free woman. There would be ill will there, and that could come across in her testimony. Obviously, a person can't refuse to testify in a trial, but you want your witnesses to be sympathetic towards the prosecution. And if you've just slapped a couple of matching bracelets on them, then it's going to be harder. And of course, they want the jury to feel sorry for Jenn. And it's going to be harder for a jury to feel sorry for Jenn if she has her own charges up against her. Like I said, I think there's more than enough evidence from Stearns' own Google Drive and his phone to nail him. But I think the prosecution is after the maximum sentence. They want to guarantee that this guy goes down for good. And they want to guarantee that they get the best decision from the jurors that they do. And I believe to achieve that Jenn needs to appear as almost the victim in this case also. The jury is going to... They want the jury to have sympathy for Jenn. So there's a lot of things that we're not going to hear in Stearns' trial that would make Jenn look bad. They want the jury to hate Stearns. They want the jury to see him as being the sole perpetrator of these crimes so that they can get the maximum penalty. And we know this has been done before. We've heard instances where a partner or a wife or whatever has been prosecuted after the trial of the main culprit. It's part of strategy there. Use this person as a witness and then nail them for their part in the crime. Now, another thing which I actually don't think is a consideration, but something that we should at least think about, is that in terms of prosecuting, there's a few things that have to exist before a person can be charged with a crime. Either there needs to be a grand jury indictment, which is what happened with Stearns' death penalty case, or the prosecutor has to be shown enough evidence for them to feel that they have a rock-solid case. Now, I don't think that in this case they would be relying on a grand jury for Jenn. So, I don't think we need to think about that. But if they were, we have to remember that a grand jury only meets 2 or 3 times a month. And there are multiple cases existing in Florida. So, if it was something that was a grand jury decision, sometimes these things take time. Personally, I think that the prosecution of Jenn will occur from detectives bringing a case to the public prosecutor and the prosecutor saying, yes, you have a strong enough case, or no, you don't have a strong enough case, go away, get more evidence and come back. So I think we're looking at one of two things here. Either they are still working on getting enough evidence together to charge Jenn and to build a strong enough case against her, or that they want her as a friendly witness, friendly towards the prosecution. They want to use her as a friendly witness in Stearns' case, in which case having her facing her own charges is going to be detrimental. Now, the reason that I believe that they are going to be prosecuting Jenn, the strongest reason, aside from the fact that it seems like a slam dunk in terms of the child negligence, it's pretty damn clear, in my opinion. I think Florida law is pretty clear there. But the thing that to me really stands out is the derivative use interview. Now, they warned her in that interview at the very beginning that they could not charge her or use anything against her if it was an admission made by her during that interview. Meaning that if she were to say in that interview, I knew all along what had happened and I covered for him, unless they could prove that elsewhere, unless they could prove that independently of that interview, they couldn't use it. Likewise, in terms of her negligence with allowing Maddie to sleep upstairs with Stearns, any admissions made regarding that in her interview, which they could not independently prove from other sources outside of that interview, would be inadmissible. Why am I saying this? Because when you watch that interview, it's actually very, very skillfully done. They basically controlled that from the beginning to the end. They didn't give Jenn a lot of open questions. A lot of the time, they gave her factual information and asked her to confirm if that was the case. So you started a new job, you came home at 10:30. Is that correct? That sort of thing. They've asked her questions which they have solid proof of, so that they know what the answers for those questions are, and those answers are going to help to nail Stearns' ass to the wall, basically. But while asking those questions, they kept the pace moving. If Jenn went to talk about something that they didn't want her talking about, they were pretty quick to redirect and get her talking about something different. There were a number of times when they redirected the conversation and steered away from something before Jenn could bring it up. There's also a number of things that weren't asked in that interview. Things that would have incriminated Jenn, essentially, had she been asked, because she would have had to have lied or would have had to admit something different to what she had previously admitted. So I think when we look at that interview, we see the number of times that they redirected the questioning, the number of times they redirected what Jenn was talking about, and the number of things that they didn't ask her. That makes me confident that there is a case against Jenn, and that they will be bringing a case against Jenn, and that we will see that occurring in the future, quite likely after Stefan has gone to trial. So the other thing that makes me feel confident that there is a case in the works against Jenn is the absence of information in what has been released for FOIA requests. There is just mounds and mounds and mounds of interviews, data, so many things recorded, but what's missing from all that is data from Jenn's phone, multiple text messages from Jenn's phone. We know, for example, that the detectives have text messages from Jenn's phone referring to instances of Maddie and Stefan sleeping together on numerous occasions. That's not been released. There's been very little released in terms of location data with Jenn's phone, other than when it's been released in relation to Stefan's case. So the majority of the things that have not been released, the things that people are still trying to chase up and get hold of, are things that pertain to Jenn Soto. There is a document in one of the larger document folders which is actually a request to seal files. Now that predates the grand jury decision for Stearns, so it is of course possible that it could just have been related to Stearns's red rum charges. But it could also relate to Jenn Soto. So the fact that that order was made, sealing files, could be promising in terms of there being charges coming for Jenn. Because like I said, when you look at what has been released via FOIA, there is so much information missing when it comes to Jenn Soto, including, like I said, her phone data. We haven't been given records of phone calls made when, at what times for Jenn. These are things that we've had to figure out from interviews from other people. We have been shown her location for much of the period of time from that morning through to when they went to the hotel, essentially. Well, not even that. Through till when they returned to the apartment on the Monday night. But there's so much missing. So I think we can be hopeful that the reason that there is so much information missing relating to Jenn's movements, Jenn's phone calls, Jenn's text messages, etc., is because there are charges coming. Now, these are all just my thoughts on the situation based on the various things that we've looked at in all the videos looking at Jenn. I love to hear other people's opinions, and I'd love to hear your opinions on this. So hopefully YouTube won't be turning my comments off on this video, because I think there's going to be some really good comments made by people as a result of this video. So please do let me know your thoughts on this. Do you think Jenn will be prosecuted? Do you think she deserves to be prosecuted? Or do you think she's just some poor innocent victim in all this? So I'll leave it there. I think this has ended up being a fairly long one. I hadn't expected it to be quite so long. But I'll leave it at that. Let me know any other factors that may contribute towards her being charged or work against her being charged, if there's any that you feel I've missed. Also, share your thoughts down below, because I love hearing what you have to say. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit the like button. That is one of the things that YouTube loves. Gets my videos out into the algorithm, gets them seen by more people. And of course, please leave a comment. Thank you, and I will catch you in the next one.
Give a